And I know people are mainly focused on making sure that there's more than one voice if the U.S. decides to use nuclear weapons first. This plan allows more than one person to weigh in, even if the U.S. is under attack.
That's the voice of Lisbeth Gronlund, research affiliate in the Department of Nuclear Science and Engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Michelle Dover and Tom Kalina.
Welcome back to Press the Button, and happy belated Valentine's Day and happy Lunar New Year, Tom. Did you do anything fun over the long weekend in this year of the ox?
Well, happy Valentine's Day to you too, Michelle. I stayed inside playing games and watching movies, and I recommend Mamma Mia for anyone who has not seen it and loves ABBA. How was your Valentine's Day?
Very quiet, very much a quarantine Valentine's Day.
Excellent, excellent. Sounds appropriate. Well, let's dive into today's episode because I know there was a lot of ground to cover. Starting off, what do you have lined up for us on Early Warning?
Today on Early Warning, we talk about the Korean Peninsula, the current state of diplomacy with North Korea, and we hear about a new report from Women Cross DMZ, who is a part of the coalition that released it.
And after that, I sit down with MIT physicist Lisbeth Gronlund. Together, we break down presidential sole authority and talk about the big idea she and her colleagues have for taking the nuclear button out of the hands of a single person. It's a great conversation you won't want to miss. And this issue is even more important now that we have seen in new video footage how close the Capitol Hill mob got to Vice President Pence and his nuclear football. And to expand on this, if the mob had seized Pence's nuclear football, they may not have been able to order an actual launch, but the public may not have known that. So parading the nuclear button around would have caused widespread panic and chaos as authorities scrambled to respond. And moreover, the briefcase contains the most secret nuclear strike plans that would surely have been revealed. This could have been a disaster that raises the question of why we still have the football at all. And of course, the bigger danger was that President Trump at that time had his own football that could have been used to end civilization as we know it. So fascinating information that is still coming out about all this.
You are definitely not going to want to miss this interview. So, and remember, if you like what you hear, please hit subscribe and leave us a rating. You help spread the word about the podcast, and we really appreciate that. But with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, Early Warning. Early Warning. Early Warning. Early Warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. Today I'm joined by Catherine Killow, Advocacy and Leadership Coordinator of Women Cross DMZ, and Dr. John Carl Baker, Senior Program Officer and Nuclear Field Coordinator here at Plowshares Fund. Catherine, John Carl, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you both back. And as you know, we have 7 minutes to cover the week's nuclear news starting now. Catherine, recently, Korea Peace Now, a global coalition of women's peace organizations, released a new report called Path to Peace, the case for a peace agreement to end the Korean War, which makes the case that a peace agreement would both lower tensions and make room for progress on issues such as improved human rights and denuclearization. How can an agreement succeed where pressure has failed?
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, we put this report together to address that question and really all the misconceptions and concerns about a peace-first approach. I think for a lot of people, the concept of putting a peace agreement before North Korea denuclearizes raises a lot of questions like, wouldn't that legitimize North Korea as a nuclear weapon state? Or, what would North Korea have to give up for the U.S. to sign an agreement? But what this report offers is really a new framework for resolving the security crisis. And that's by really getting to the core of the nuclear dispute which is the unresolved Korean War. And that's why a peace agreement, we're arguing, should come first, because the Korean War is sort of the foundation of all the security issues that we're faced with on the Korean Peninsula today, and that are just getting worse. The report finds that a peace agreement, it wouldn't legally imply recognition of North Korea as a nuclear weapons state, and it shouldn't be considered, a reward for bad behavior. There's this notion that, a peace agreement has to occur, at the end of a process, that it's the culmination of deals. But in this context, because the Korean context is very strange, there was a failure to replace the armistice with a binding peace agreement. So that's what we're saying is actually the necessary starting point. And it's really the beginning of a very long process toward a peace regime, which is something that both the U.S. and North Korea have agreed to in the past. I would just say that, the big takeaway here is that if we could actually end the wartime status quo, that would allow us to engage with one another on more normal diplomatic terms, so that we could better negotiate an actual nuclear deal.
Now, several prominent members of Congress have supported this report, including Representatives Barbara Lee, Jan Schakowsky, and Ilhan Omar. Do you see a role for Congress in the coming year on this issue?
Yes, thanks for giving them a shout out. Those are some of our big Korea peace champions. They were original co-sponsors of our bill HRES 152, which calls on the U.S. to formally end the Korean War. That's absolutely something that Congress should pick up again this year. We anticipate the bill will be reintroduced. And now that the Democrats pretty much control the House and Senate, we are hoping that this bill gets a lot more support in this Congress. And hopefully it's not seen as something that is running counter or against President Biden's efforts. We know that they're still doing a policy review on North Korea, so it may be too soon to say, where that effort, HRES 152, aligns with the administration or doesn't. But we don't want to go backwards. We don't want to see a return to strategic patience. And that's where Congress can support the president in calling for a new approach.
So, John Carl, Catherine has started to touch on this, but what do you expect us to see from the Biden administration on this issue?
Well, the short answer is we don't really know yet. They seem to be proceeding pretty carefully. Right now, they're reviewing their Korea policies. We know that Secretary of State Blinken has said that they're considering both pressure, which means sanctions, and incentives, but that doesn't honestly tell us a whole lot about what they might do. They've also said they're going to move forward once they've completed the review and they've consulted with our allies in the region, which are South Korea and Japan. They want everyone to be on the same page, apparently. But the trouble is that South Korea and Japan, their governments do not really agree on North Korea policy, and in some ways have some very fundamental disagreements about it. So it's going to be interesting to see what the admin comes out with, and to see how the South Korean and Japanese governments respond, because it's a really contentious issue.
So last Wednesday, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un criticized the party's economic plans, calling the current economic crisis the, quote, worst ever. What can the United States expect from North Korea if it chooses to re-engage diplomatically?
Well, they're going to want sanctions relief. And that's not just because their economy is doing poorly, though clearly that's a factor. Sanctions relief was their main demand during the Trump administration, and I think it's going to continue to be. But the economic situation doesn't mean that they're anxious for a deal and they're going to go along with any old thing the U.S. throws at them. We can still expect they're going to be tough negotiators. Like it or not, the DPRK has a very advanced program. They're in a really good bargaining position, and they're not just going to give up their nukes in the near term. So the U.S. would stand a much better chance if it lowers its immediate expectations and shoots for something much more modest that might slow or freeze their program instead of just getting rid of it entirely. I think it's fine to keep denuclearization as a long-term goal. We should do that. But the Biden administration would make a lot more progress toward it if it doesn't go for the whole enchilada up front.
Well, with that, our 7 minutes are up. Catherine, John Carl, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
We are recording this show on February 10th, and as we speak, President Trump is on trial in the Senate for inciting a riot at the Capitol just last month. That experience also raised major concerns about an unhinged president having sole authority to launch nuclear weapons. That danger was so acute that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi actively looked for ways to prevent, quote, an unstable president from accessing the launch codes and ordering a nuclear strike, unquote. That experience has drawn much needed attention to the policy of presidential sole authority, and we here at Plowshares are committed to ending that policy and exploring different ways to do that. So today, I am delighted to welcome Elizabeth Gronlund, who is a research affiliate at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the Department of Nuclear Science and Engineering. And from 2002 to 2020, just last year, she co-directed the Global Security Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And I should add that before that, Lisbeth and I worked together at UCS. And before that, we were at Cornell University together. So we go way back. And Lisbeth, it's such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, we agree that sole authority and first use of nuclear weapons should be prohibited as a way to avoid future situations where unhinged presidents have their finger on the button. But let's start with sole authority. And can you talk about why you think this policy is so dangerous?
Yes. I want to note, though, that there is a positive aspect to it. It was set up many, many decades ago to be sure that the military was not the one who got to make the decision, and to be sure that it was under civilian control. So that's good. Now, of course, that decision still rests with one person, and it would be a momentous decision no matter what circumstance the U.S. was under, whether the U.S. had already been attacked or whether it was contemplating using them first. And I think no one person should be allowed to make that decision. And then to make things worse, there are situations under which the decider would have about 10 minutes to be briefed by the military and make a decision, which is even more dangerous.
And you have an interesting proposal on sole authority, that it should require both a presidential order and an agreement from the next two people in the presidential line of succession, normally the vice president and the Speaker of the House. Can you describe how that would work?
Yes, I do want to say that that proposal was also dreamt up by Steve Fetter at University of Maryland and David Wright, my co-director for many years at UCS. And so it uses the fact that the U.S. constantly tracks the people in the presidential line of succession, because if the president is assassinated or, has a heart attack, the U.S. wants to be sure that the baton immediately is passed to the next person in line. The military in particular wants to be sure that there is no gap. There's no leadership gap, because they want to be able to get the approval to use nuclear weapons if they think they need it. And so the argument is that, therefore, there isn't an incentive for a country to assassinate the president, take advantage of, the gap and launch weapons at the U.S. I mean, that's obviously not the only reason. So FEMA tracks, as I said, the vice president, next in line, Speaker of the House, and then we have the Senate pro tempore, and it goes on down like that. And it is able to communicate with these people very immediately, almost immediately, and securely. So, to the extent that the US military is able to reach the president, they're also able to reach these other people. Now, there have been proposals that there should be other people in the loop, and some people have proposed that it be the Secretary of Defense and the Attorney General. We think there is a particular benefit to having the people in the line of succession because they would become president and have this authority. So they have some legitimacy to be making this call. The other advantage is, the people on the top of the list have all been elected. And so there is, some Democratic input, very small d, but still better than nothing. And the president can't fire these people. So, the president can't say, well, I don't agree, out of here, we'll take the next one. So those are the reasons we think that strategy makes sense. And I know people are mainly focused on making sure that there's more than one voice if the U.S. decides to use nuclear weapons first. This plan allows more than one person to weigh in, even if the U.S. is under attack. So the president would have 10 minutes, but there's no reason that these other people cannot also be hooked in. And if you can't, it just goes back to the president. So the assumption that this would take too long is not true in this case.
Now, I'm very aware of this argument that the president must decide quickly. And I'm wondering if you think that's a valid argument, that there actually is a benefit to having the president be able to make a decision about nuclear launch within just a few minutes.
Well, it is the consequence of another bad policy the U.S. has, which is that it keeps its land-based missiles. There are 400 in silos in the middle of the country. They're sitting ducks in a way. Everybody knows where they are. And so if Russia, for whatever reason, decided to attack the U.S., it would obviously, or the assumption is that it would aim at those 400 missiles. It takes about 25 minutes for a long-range missile to get from one country to the other. So U.S. Satellite sensors and radars would pick up the launch, which also takes some time, and then it would go to the computers. And ultimately, if the military thought, well, this is real, then it goes up to the president. And they say, okay, here's some options. And the president chooses. And they could say no, but that's not the presumption, right? The presumption is the U.S. is under attack. There are lots of weapons coming in. You got to decide right now. And it's all driven by the fact that these silo-based weapons are vulnerable because they're just, everybody knows where they are. Unlike the submarines, the U.S. has most of its weapons on submarines, and nobody knows where they are. So now, a long time ago, when land-based missiles were first fielded, the submarine weapons were not as accurate. They weren't as big, and people felt like they just weren't good enough. And that's not true. That hasn't been true for many, many decades. So there is no reason to have this policy. No reason. And it requires that these weapons be on alert so they can be launched quickly, which is in itself a danger because of cyber attack possibilities.
Now, the fix to sole authority that you're proposing, and all fixes to sole authority, would require the president to give up sole authority, to share that authority with others, which some have said, hey, no president would ever do that. So if you were in a private meeting with President Biden, say, how would you propose to him that he should limit his own nuclear authority, and why?
I would say, President Biden, you may feel confident that if it came down to needing to make a decision about whether or not the U.S. should use nuclear weapons, the military would come to you and say, we think we need to do this. And you could, of course, also bring in any advisors you wanted to, but you're not required to. By making it, taking this on as a requirement for yourself, you are setting a standard for future presidents who may not be as wise as you. And that's really the point, is to try to change this norm, change this policy. So you would be setting a standard for the future.
Right, when we may not have such enlightened, stable leadership.
Well, and also, nobody knows really, Mr. President. Nobody knows how they would feel in the moment having to make this decision. And having more people at the table, who would, be able to weigh in those final minutes may make everybody feel better, including the president.
Now, there is, as our listeners know, a bill in Congress, the Markey-Liu bill that was recently reintroduced, that would require Congress to authorize first use with the president. In other words, it would be shared authority. The president could want to do a first strike, but Congress would have to declare war and therefore share the authority for a first strike. Right. Similar to your proposal, but different. What do you think of this approach? And more generally, do you see a role for Congress in limiting sole authority? Right.
So two things. First off, so the legislation would allow first use, which, of course, I and others in our community don't want to allow first use, no matter who says it's okay. And it also, inherently could not be applied in a situation where the U.S. was launching second and not first. Whereas our scheme allows that. Just a little plug. So I think in practice, let's just say this law passed, it would be tied up. I mean, there are legal issues that I don't understand, but I don't think it's a shoo-in. My guess is that it would end up before the Supreme Court. This would take some time if it passed. So I think that given our clock is ticking, actually, we have a moment, I think, and I would argue that the first step is getting Biden to agree to these things. And that Congress, sort of maybe another way to think about it, is Congress would then try to prevent a future president from undoing it. On the other hand, this is a very good thing that they're doing. It attracts attention, which is always good, because when people learn about this, they are frankly appalled. And it also puts some pressure on the administration, both positive and negative, right? If you don't do this, we're going to be unhappy and we're going to make noise. On the other hand, if you do it, we're going to back you up. So I think it's very valuable in those two senses, even if it doesn't become law. Okay, it has real political value. The two sort of complications is that, there's a gray area in terms of legality about, Congress has the right to declare war, but the president is commander in chief. And I mean, there are precedents, and you could imagine that carefully crafted, there could be legislation that would basically survive, a Supreme Court, that there are ways to limit what the military can do.
There's the Markey-Liu bill in Congress now stipulates that that the United States could not use nuclear weapons with the approval of Congress unless the United States had already been certifiably attacked buy nuclear weapons, therefore trying to get out of this launch under attack situation, which we know is so risky in terms of false alarms, cyber attacks, bad information, that kind of thing. Where do you come down on that issue?
Well, I think the word certified, unless it is explicitly identified as explosions detected on U.S. soil or allied soil, there's a big loophole. The military is very quick to object when you say the U.S. policy allows launch on warning of attack. They say allows launch under attack. So they're saying that they can certify that the U.S. is being attacked, based on their sensors and their analysis of it. So that is the argument that, yes, they are certifying this. And I would say, no, really, the only way to certify is if there is an explosion and you detect that, which is not hard to do. And, and I think the way the legislation is framed, if they don't specify exactly, there's a loophole there. That the military will surely exploit. So I think that's a really important question, actually, because it gets to the heart of, is this really a first strike? The U.S., is it a second strike or first strike that the U.S. is launching? So I understand that the legislation really tries to get at it, but I think it needs to really, really pound the nails in, or it will come loose.
And just so our listeners understand, what we're talking about is a very risky situation where the United States might launch its nuclear weapons on warning of attack, which could be a false alarm, could be misinformation, could be a cyber attack of some kind, and therefore the president might think he or she is responding to a nuclear attack, but might actually be starting a nuclear war. Which is something that we should all want to avoid. But of course, it raises this kind of taboo issue, which is that that logically, rationally, we should never launch nuclear weapons until we can be sure that nuclear weapons have landed on our territory. People don't like to talk about this for obvious reasons, but we like to talk about the things we can't ever talk about on this show.
Yeah, well, it all harkens back to these land-based missiles that are sitting ducks. And if you wait until there's an actual explosion, they have just been destroyed. That's the assumption. So as long and the military pushes back and says, well, no, we're not really launching them on warning, because it's more than a warning. We really, really, really are sure that the warning is right, but it's still warning. So it all goes back to those land-based missiles. None of the other weapons are vulnerable to that kind of first strike. One thing that we have argued and others in our community have argued is to take them off alert so they cannot be launched quickly. And one thing that we had proposed is each silo has a off button so that people who are doing maintenance don't accidentally, become part of a launch. And so you could go and turn all those buttons off. And you could have a little camera if you wanted to, let other countries know that you've done that. So it would just be physically impossible to do it. So this is a very quick measure. I mean, there are all kinds of other measures that you could come up with. But I think once you get to the point, and the military would say, well, yes, but that's the first step to getting rid of it, which in a way, if you can't launch them quickly, they really are pointless. So I do think that all of these things are wrapped up together. The land-based missiles are a problem for many, many reasons, and that's one of them.
On that note, I think we're going to end it there, Elizabeth. We are out of time. This has been a great conversation. I'm sure we will talk about these issues again, and thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Sender, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Sender. Audio engineering by Derek Sender and Will Lowry. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.